The Bitterroot Valley in November 1878 wore its silence like armor. From the ridge above, a man could count every homestead by the smoke rising from its chimney-thick laboring columns that bent eastward in the wind and told anyone who knew how to read them exactly what kind of winter was coming. The pines on the upper slopes had already surrendered their color, standing dark and rigid against a sky the particular shade of pewter that old-timers called a warning sky, the kind that sat low and heavy for weeks before it finally broke open and buried everything underneath it. The wagon road that cut through the valley floor had softened in the last rain and then hardened again overnight into something that grabbed at wheel rims and bruised horse hooves. And the few travelers who passed along it in those early November days moved quickly, shoulders hunched, eyes on the distance ahead rather than the landscape around them. Nobody lingered in the Bitterroot when the sky looked like that. Nobody except Eleanor Marsh, who stood in her backfield with a pickaxe and worked the frozen earth like she had a quarrel with it. Her neighbors had been watching for 3 weeks by then, watching in the way that people in small communities watch things that confuse them from a careful distance, with the studied casualness of someone who just happens to be looking in that direction, who just happens to have paused their own work at exactly the moment worth noticing. Thomas Holt had noticed first. His property shared a fence line with hers along the creek that bent northward past the willow stand, and his hay work had brought him close enough to the boundary to see clearly what she was doing, or rather, to see that what she was doing made no sense to him, which was a different and more troubling thing. He watched her carry dirt out of a hillside in a canvas sling, steady and methodical, and he had tried to match what he was seeing to any category of work he understood, and the categories kept failing him. Every other property in the Bitterroot Valley was consumed with the same preparation that had been consuming every family in this part of Montana for the past 6 weeks. The math of winter survival was not complicated, but it was unforgiving. A household needed enough seasoned firewood to last from first hard freeze to spring thaw, and in a valley where the temperatures regularly dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks, that calculation demanded serious tonnage. Men cut and men split, and men stacked and their wives and children carried and covered and stacked again. And the wood piles that rose around the homesteads were monuments to the work involved. Chest high, some of them, or shoulder high, covered with bark sheets and canvas tops weighted down with stones, representing weeks of swung axes and aching backs, and the particular satisfaction of watching something necessary take shape. A man's woodpile was not exactly a point of pride, but it was not exactly not a point of pride either. You could tell a great deal about a family's prospects by walking past their property in October. Eleanor Marsh's property told a story that nobody in the valley quite knew how to read. She had a modest stack near her woodshed, perhaps enough for 2 or 3 weeks if she burned carefully. If the temperature stayed above what the November clouds were promising, they would not stay above. Beyond that, nothing visible. No sprawling rows of split timber covered against the weather. No evidence of the sustained cutting work that every other homestead in the valley had been engaged in since September. She had a small shed, a cabin that her husband had finished barely a year before he died, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the winter, and a hillside that she was apparently excavating, for reasons that Thomas Holt could not determine from his side of the fence line. He told himself it was not his business. He told himself this for 11 days before he rode over. She came to the door before he finished dismounting, which meant she had heard him coming, which meant she was paying attention to things. He noticed that even before he noticed the warmth that reached him through the open door, a steady, even warmth that his own house had not managed in the past week, despite the fire he kept burning from morning to night. He filed that observation away without quite knowing why it mattered yet. He told her he had been noticing the work she was doing on the hillside, and he asked with the careful phrasing of a man trying not to give offense whether everything was all right, whether she needed any help with her winter preparations, whether perhaps there was something he could do. She thanked him with a composure that he found slightly disconcerting, the composure of a person who has already worked out exactly what they intend to say before the conversation begins. She told him she was building a root cellar, a deeper one than the small storage pit she had been using, positioned up the slope where the drainage would keep it drier. She said it with perfect reasonableness because it was a reasonable thing to do, because root cellars were common, because women living alone needed places to store vegetables through the winter, and because nothing she had said was technically untrue in any way that he could identify in the moment. He nodded. He offered his help again. She declined again politely with the same steady assurance, and he rode home with his cart of split pine and the nagging sense that he had been answered without being told anything. His wife Margaret listened to his account over supper, with the focused attention she brought to everything that interested her, which was most things. She turned the information over in her mind, the way she turned dough, not quickly, but with purpose. She pointed out that root cellars did not require excavating horizontally into a hillside, which was what Thomas had described seeing. She pointed out that the angle he had described sounded more like what you would do if you wanted to go into the hill rather than down beneath it. She asked him how deep he thought the opening was, and when he said he was not sure, she said she thought he should look more carefully next time he was near the fence line. He said he was not in the habit of spying on neighbors. She said she was not suggesting spying, just looking. And there was a difference, and besides, the woman had been a widow for 9 months, and it was already November. And whatever she was building alone, and the least they could do was understand enough to help her if she needed it. Eleanor Marsh had been before she was Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor Whitfield of Keweenaw County, Michigan, and she had carried that education across half a continent to a quarter section of Montana Territory that her husband James had filed on in 1875 and spent 3 years turning from raw land into something that might become a farm. She had grown up in the Upper Peninsula, in that crooked finger of land, reaching out into the lakes where winter lasted most of the year, and where you learn to solve problems in places with no one to ask for help. Her father had surveyed land for the government, and his work had taken him away for months at a time into wilderness that did not appear on any map yet. And he had come back from these absences carrying the kind of knowledge you could not get from books. Her mother had been a school teacher who spoke 3 languages and calculated board-foot measurements in her head, faster than most men managed with pencil and paper, and had raised her daughter to believe that the measure of a thing was whether it worked not, whether it looked the way you expected it to look. James Marsh had died in February, 7 weeks before the ground thawed enough to bury him properly. He had been helping a neighbor bring down timber on the north slope when a pine shifted wrong during the fall and caught him in a way that left him no chance of recovery. He had lasted 4 days. Eleanor had stayed by him for all of them, and when it was over, she had done what needed to be done in the order it needed to be done, because the alternative was to stop doing things. And she understood clearly that stopping was not an option available to her. 9 months later, she was in a field with a pickaxe, and her neighbors were watching with the particular mix of pity and helplessness that communities feel when they see someone making what they believe to be a serious mistake and cannot find a way to stop them. She had not always known what she was going to build when the first hard planning began in late August, sitting at her kitchen table with paper and a stub of pencil, working through the numbers of what the winter would require and what she actually had available to provide it. The arithmetic was straightforward and discouraging. She had $12 in cash money. She had the tools James had left behind, which were good tools, cared-for tools, the tools of a man who understood that in places like this, your equipment was not a luxury. She had 2 months before the ground froze too deep to work effectively. She had her own labor, which was substantial. What she did not have was money to hire men to cut timber, or a team strong enough to haul the quantities of wood she would need if she was going to manage the winter. The way her neighbors managed it, with great visible reserves of split timber ranked along their fence lines, like a public statement of readiness. The memory had come to her not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow surfacing. The way important things sometimes returned quietly, while she was doing something else, while she was thinking about the drainage problem in the garden. She had been 9 years old visiting a family near the lake in Michigan with her father, who was working a survey in the area and had stopped for an evening's hospitality. The family had a farm that sat at the base of a gentle slope, and she remembered following the older daughter down to a place in the hillside where a door sat nearly flush with the earth, wooden braced with iron, unremarkable unless you knew what it was. Inside shelves of stored goods, the smell of cold dry air, and along the back walls stacked with precise efficiency cords of firewood that looked and smelled as though they had just been split. The daughter had explained it the way children explain things they had grown up taking for granted, without drama or emphasis, just fact. The earth kept at a certain temperature cool enough to preserve things, but not cold enough to freeze them. And the wood stayed dry because the ventilation was right, and because the earth down there did not hold moisture the way the air did. Eleanor had filed it in the part of her mind where useful observations went, the part her mother had trained her to maintain, and she had not thought of it specifically again for 25 years. When it surfaced in August, she spent a week testing the memory against everything she knew about soil temperature, drainage, and the behavior of wood in varying humidity conditions. Her father had taught her to survey, which meant he had taught her to read terrain, the way a slope oriented itself toward drainage, the composition of soil at different depths, the way water moved underground in spring, and what evidence it left behind in summer. She walked the property for 3 days before she chose the site, a low rise about 9 meters behind the cabin oriented south, composed of dense clay mixed with glacial stone, the kind of substrate that stayed dry because water ran around it rather than through it. She paced the distance from the cabin door carefully and drove a stake. Then she went back inside and drew the design on paper, the way her father had drawn survey lines precisely with measurements marked at every critical point. The excavation took longer than she had planned, because the soil at depth was harder than the surface suggested, because she was working alone with tools sized for a larger person, and because she refused to compromise the drainage channel she had dug to redirect any subsurface water away from the chamber. She worked 2 to 3 hours each morning before the heat of midday made the work less efficient, and she worked another hour in the late afternoon when the shadows from the ridge gave her shade. She carried dirt out in the canvas sling she had made from an old tent panel, walking the same path each time, depositing the material far enough from the opening that it would not become a visible excavation mound. She was aware that Thomas Holt had ridden over, and she was aware that he would ride over again if he kept seeing her at work. So she timed her most obvious labor for the periods when she knew from observation that he was occupied on his own property. The second visit from Thomas Holt came on a Wednesday in the second week of October, when the rains had started and the sky had lowered itself onto the valley like a lid being set on a pot. He arrived in late afternoon with his older son riding beside him, and a look on his face that had moved past polite concern into something more specific. He had seen the opening in the hillside more clearly this time, had seen that it went horizontally into the slope rather than vertically down into the earth. And he was a man who had built enough structures to know that what he was looking at did not match what she had told him she was building. He did not accuse her of anything. He was too careful and too decent for that. But the question in his face was not the same question it had been 2 weeks ago. She asked him about Margaret's health, whether the shoulder that had been bothering her since summer had improved. She asked about the cattle, whether the new fence line had held through the last storm. She asked with genuine interest because she did like Margaret, because she did care about the fence, and because these were the right questions to ask a neighbor who had come to her door in the rain. By the time the conversation had moved through its natural arc, Thomas had accepted a cup of coffee and spent 20 minutes in the warmth of her kitchen and ridden away with his son without having extracted any new information about the hillside. His son had looked back once from the road. She had been standing in the doorway with the coffee cup still in her hand, and she had met his eyes with perfect composure, and he had looked away first. She went back inside and added wood to the stove and calculated that she had perhaps 10 more days of work before the chamber was ready to fill. And she decided that 10 days was enough if she started earlier and worked later. What she was building was not architecturally complex, and its simplicity was part of its genius, not because it required no thought, but because it required such concentrated thought that it arrived at the other side of complexity and came out clean. The chamber she had cut into the hillside was 3 meters deep and 2 meters wide, with a ceiling she could stand upright in if she kept her head straight. The wall she had faced with flat stones gathered from the creek bed, fitted without mortar, in the dry stack method her father had used for every wall he had built that needed to last. The floor she had lined with the same creek stone, laid flat and tight with a slope of perhaps 2 degrees toward the entrance to encourage any moisture that found its way in to find its way back out. Near the ceiling, she had cut 2 small openings angled upward and lined with split shingles that directed airflow inward from outside while preventing direct precipitation from entering. The entrance she had framed with timber salvaged from an abandoned sluice box she had found half buried in the creek bank, and onto this frame she had hung a door of her own construction, braced diagonally against racking hinged with iron hardware she had purchased in Stevensville in September. The door sat flush with the hillside when closed. Over it, she laid sod cut from the meadow, in strips overlapping them like shingles, tucking the edges under each other, in the way she had watched her father lay sod over a root house roof when she was small. Over the sod she spread a layer of dead grass, and the door disappeared into the hillside as completely as if it had grown there. She placed 3 specific stones in a triangular arrangement a meter to the left of the entrance, close enough to the ground that snow would cover them only partially enough, left visible to guide her hand to the door handle in the dark in a blizzard in any condition the winter could manufacture. She loaded the chamber on 5 consecutive days in the last week of October, working with the methodical efficiency of someone who has planned a physical task precisely and is now executing it without wasted motion. She had been cutting and splitting since July, working the deadfall timber in the north corner of her property that James had identified but never gotten to, and she had been stacking it in the woodshed through the summer. The timber was lodgepole pine Douglas fir and a section of cottonwood that she split into thin pieces because cottonwood burned faster, and she would use it for quick morning fires. All of it had been cut in summer when the sap was down, and it had cured through 3 months of Montana sun and wind into wood that rang when you struck 2 pieces together, the particular hollow sound of properly seasoned timber. She loaded it into the chamber in the canvas sling she had designed for exactly this purpose, stacking the wood inside with spaces between the pieces to allow the air from the ventilation channels to continue circulating through the stack. When the chamber was full, she calculated that she had enough fuel to last until the first week of March, possibly later if she managed her consumption with the discipline that living alone had taught her was always available when necessity required it. She closed the door. She pulled the sod back into position over the top. She walked back to the cabin and stood on the step and looked at the hillside and could not see from where she stood any indication that anything was there. The night before she finished loading the chamber, she had sat at the entrance in the dark and looked up at the stars coming out over the ridge, and she had thought about James. He had said once that the land would take care of them if they learned how to ask it the right questions. He had meant it as a general encouragement, the kind of thing you said when you were filing on a quarter section that was mostly rock and creek and stubbornness. She had taken it literally because she had found that literal interpretation was more reliable than figurative because it gave you something to actually do. She had asked the land what it held constant when everything else changed, and the land had answered her 9 degrees in a clay hillside, patient and consistent in the way the earth always was when you put the right question to it. She would carry that answer into the winter ahead alone, and the winter would either confirm it or correct it, and either way, she would know something true. The woodshed held perhaps 3 weeks of fuel, enough to deflect attention enough to make it plausible that she was being mildly reckless rather than executing a plan that nobody in the valley would understand if she tried to explain it. She had tried, actually. In late September, at the Stevensville trading post, she had mentioned to Margaret Holt that she was thinking about underground storage for her winter fuel supply, and Margaret had looked at her with the polite blankness of a woman who has heard an unusual idea and is deciding whether to engage with it. The look had told Eleanor everything she needed to know about how the conversation would go. She had not raised the subject again with anyone. The rains continued through the end of October and into the first days of November, the kind that came in sideways with the wind and found every gap in every covering, every weakness in every tarp, every place where bark sheets had shifted and left an opening. Eleanor watched from her window during the worst of it and thought about the chamber in the hillside with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose calculation has proved correct. The rain could not reach what she had put underground. The wood was sitting in 9-degree stillness, drier now than when she had put it, in the residual moisture still working its way out through the ventilation channels into the cold moving air above. When the temperatures began to drop 15 below at night, within the first week of November, the sky suddenly clearing to that particular hard blue, that meant the cold had arrived in earnest. She began to understand the full significance of what she had done. Because what she could not see from her window, she could infer from the way the smoke rose from her neighbor's chimneys, heavy dark fighting itself upward in the dense, cold air. The sign of wet wood burning badly, producing half its potential heat, and 3 times its potential smoke, consuming itself at twice the rate of dry timber, because the fire was spending its energy driving out moisture before it could generate warmth. Her own chimney produced a thin white column that rose straight and consistent regardless of the hour, because dry wood burned clean and hot and steadily, because her stove was not fighting the fuel, because she had roughly 1.25 cords of perfectly conditioned timber sitting 9 meters from her back door in steady underground darkness, waiting for her to come collect it. She went to the chamber every 3 days. Each trip took less than 10 minutes. Walk to the hillside, clear snow from the door if necessary. Descend 5 wooden steps into the chamber, load the canvas sling with enough timber for 72 hours of careful burning, climb back out. Close the door, walk back to the cabin. To anyone watching from the road, it looked like she was checking something near the outbuildings, nothing worth studying. Nobody watched closely because nobody expected to see anything worth watching. This was another thing she had understood from the beginning. The most effective camouflage was other people's assumptions. Thomas Holt brought her a load of split pine on a Tuesday in early November. He arrived with his older son and the cart and a manner that was kindness without condescension, and she met him at the door with the composure she had been practicing since February. The composure that had nothing to do with not feeling things and everything to do with having decided what to do about them. She thanked him. She declined to accept it as a gift. He left it anyway, stacking it near the woodshed with the quiet efficiency of a man doing something he believes is right, regardless of whether it is wanted. And she watched him go with a complicated feeling that she was not prepared to examine closely. The wood sat where he had left it, accumulating snow untouched. By the middle of November, the contrast was visible to anyone who cared to notice. The homesteads of the Bitterroot Valley were burning through their supplies faster than their autumn calculations had predicted, because the fuel was fighting them, and the fighting cost extra wood, and the extra wood drew down reserves that were supposed to last until March. Families adjusted their habits, banking fires earlier in the evening, waking to cold kitchens, wearing more layers indoors than they should have needed to. The Caldwell family had 2 cords that had been cut late and never properly cured, and those were now additionally wet, and their stove produced a sound in the early morning, like something suffering. Old Ren Purcell, who ranched alone on the eastern edge of the valley, had ridden to Stevensville and come back with purchased timber that had cost him more than he wanted to acknowledge. And the look on his face when he unloaded it was the look of a man who has done the thing that keeps him alive, but has not forgiven himself for needing to do it. And from Eleanor Marsh's cabin, the smoke rose thin and white and untroubled, the same at 7 in the morning as at 7 in the evening. The same in the hard freeze as in the brief afternoon warmth, consistent in a way that no other chimney in the visible valley managed to be. Samuel Webb had been in the valley for 14 years longer than any other resident except the Hendersons up near the confluence. He was a man who knew how to look at things and draw correct conclusions, which was a rarer quality than it sounded. And when he looked at Eleanor Marsh's chimney, and then at every other chimney in his visible range, the conclusion he drew was not the one her other neighbors had drawn. He did not conclude that she was burning her furniture. He did not conclude that she had a secret cache from her husband's time. He concluded that she had done something he had not done, something he had not thought of, and that whatever it was working considerably better than what he had done, and that he wanted to understand it. He mentioned this to no one for 2 weeks because he was a cautious man, and because he wanted to be sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. He rode past her property 3 times in that period at different hours, and the smoke was the same each time. He watched her come out of the cabin in the early morning to collect wood, and he watched her return, and he noted that she went to the hillside rather than the woodshed, and he noted that she spent a very short time there for the load she carried back. Samuel Webb was not a man who confused what he did not understand with what could not be understood. He was the kind of man who rode toward the thing that confused him rather than away from it. This was why on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, when the temperature was sitting at 12 below, and the light was already going gray at 2 in the afternoon, he rode up the wagon road to Eleanor Marsh's property and knocked on her door with the direct purpose of a man who has decided that his questions are more important than his dignity. The warmth that came through the door when she opened it was the warmth of a place that had not been fighting its own fuel supply all season. It was the warmth of a house that had maintained a consistent temperature without the desperate overburning and overcooling cycle that characterized every other home in the valley. It hit him the way things hit you when you have been moving toward an answer for weeks, and the answer finally appears not as a surprise exactly, but as a confirmation that costs you something because it means you should have found it sooner. She looked at him with the steady regard of a woman who has been waiting for this question and has already decided how to answer it. "Mrs. Marsh?" He held his hat in both hands. "I'm not here to tell you how to run your property, but every family in this valley is burning wet wood in a hard winter, and your chimney has been running clean since November started. I have been watching it for 2 weeks, and I am not able to explain it, and I think you can." She studied him for a moment, not weighing whether to trust him exactly, but measuring the quality of the question. She had been asked things before in the valley and before it, and she had learned to distinguish between people who were asking because they were genuinely curious and people who were asking because they wanted to be right about something. He looked like the first kind. "Come in," she said, "and then come out again. I want to show you something." She pulled her coat from the hook by the door and led him across the frozen ground toward the hillside, toward the 3 stones she could find in any weather, toward the door that the valley did not know was there. She reached the stones and crouched without hesitation, sweeping snow away from the doorframe with her gloved forearm in the practiced motion of someone who had done it dozens of times. Webb watched her hands find the handle with the certainty of someone who does not need to look for something they know exactly where to find. And he watched the door swing outward and down on its hinges to reveal the opening in the hillside, and he stood very still, because what he was smelling, what came up from the chamber below in a faint exhalation like a breath, let slowly out of something that had been quietly holding. It was dry wood. Not musty, not damp, not the faintly rotten smell of wood that had absorbed and then frozen and then thawed and absorbed again. Clean dry wood, dry. The way it smelled at the very beginning of a summer cutting season. 5 steps, she said. Not an invitation exactly, a statement of what the situation required. He descended. The chamber was 3 meters deep and 2 meters wide, with a ceiling that cleared his head by a few inches. The walls were faced with flat creek stone dry stacked. The floor was stone as well, laid flat and tight. And stacked along the back and side walls were cords of firewood that were in the lantern light he brought down with him, visibly and unmistakably dry surfaces free of frost-cut faces, showing the clean, pale color of properly cured timber, rather than the gray, weathered surface of wood that had spent months exposed to Montana autumn. He reached out and put his hand against one of the pieces. The surface was cool and completely dry without the faintest trace of the ice crystals that had been coating every piece of wood on his own property for the past 3 weeks. She came down 2 steps and stayed there watching him with an expression that was not exactly waiting for praise and was not exactly indifferent to it either. The expression of someone who has done work they believe in and is allowing it to be examined. He asked her how much she had stored. She told him enough to last until early March, managed carefully. And she was managing carefully. He asked how long the wood had been in the chamber. Since the last week of October, she told him, cut in July and cured through the summer before that. He asked how it was possible that the storage had maintained the wood's condition rather than degrading it. She explained it precisely because precision was how she explained everything. The earth at this depth ran approximately 9 to 10 degrees year-round. Regardless of surface conditions, the ventilation channels near the ceiling maintained a slow air movement that carried moisture out rather than allowing it to accumulate, and the result was a storage environment that was simultaneously too warm to freeze and too consistently ventilated to allow the humidity buildup that was ruining fuel stores throughout the valley. He listened to all of it without interrupting. "The earth keeps what it keeps, was," she said, "and doesn't much care what November decides to do." He climbed back up and stood for a moment looking at the hillside, at the valley spread out below them in the hard blue late afternoon light, at the other homesteads, where families were settling into another evening of struggling fires and drawn-down reserves. He turned to look at her. "Why didn't you tell anyone this was possible?" She pulled the door closed and worked the latch and began replacing the covering of dead grass over the frame. "I mentioned it in September, to your neighbor's wife at the trading post." She paused in her work. She looked at me the way people look at things that do not match the shape of what they are expecting to hear. He was quiet for a moment. He knew the look she meant. She may not have passed it along. Perhaps it sounded like something a woman who did not understand Montana winters was suggesting, because she did not know better. She finished with the door and straightened and looked at him directly. "Either way, I understood after that conversation that explaining would not work. I needed the winter to explain it for me." They walked back toward the cabin in silence, their boots finding the same uneven ground, the cold pressing down on both of them as the last light went. At the cabin door, she paused. "You can replicate it. The principles are not complicated. The work is manageable. If you start before the ground freezes completely, you can get enough wood underground to change how this winter ends for your family." He put his hat back on and gathered his reins. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man trying to find the right language for something that kept slipping past the words he had available. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Marsh, for the assumptions that were made." She met this with the slight shift of expression that was for her the equivalent of a more demonstrative person's extended response. "The ones who update their assumptions when the evidence changes are the ones worth talking to." She opened the cabin door. "Come back if you need to talk through the design. I will answer whatever you ask." He rode away into the dark, and she went inside and fed the stove from the supply she had brought up that morning. And she sat for a while in the warmth without lighting the lamp, in the particular companionship of firelight and silence that she had been learning these 9 months to distinguish from loneliness. The two things were not the same. Loneliness was the absence of something. This was the presence of something, the presence of the work done, the calculation that had proved correct, the chamber in the hillside that was doing exactly what she had built it to do. Outside in the dark, the valley's chimneys struggled on. The first week of December arrived without ceremony and without mercy. The temperature dropped to 22 below on the third night and stayed there. And the valley woke to a landscape that had been reorganized overnight into something that looked like permanence. The creek locked under ice thick enough to drive a horse across the meadow. grasses standing in frozen attitudes they would hold until April. The mud of the wagon road transformed into a corrugated surface as hard and unforgiving as poured iron. The sky was the clear, ruthless blue of a winter that had stopped threatening and started delivering, and the light that came through it was brilliant and absolutely cold, the kind of light that showed everything and warmed nothing. Thomas Holt was at his woodpile before sunrise that first hard morning, and what he found there altered the arithmetic of his winter in ways he was not prepared to address before coffee. The tarp he had weighted down with stones had shifted in the night wind, and the section of the pile it had been covering had taken 3 hours of freezing rain before the temperature dropped and locked everything solid. He stood in the dark with his lantern and worked a piece free from the stack, and knew from the weight of it and the dead sound it made when he knocked it against another piece that it was going to burn the way wet pine burned, which was with more smoke than heat and more struggle than either. He loaded his arms and carried it inside anyway because there was no other option, and he spent the next 2 hours managing a fire that required constant attention to stay alive, feeding it small pieces and adjusting the damper by degrees, while his family dressed in the cold kitchen and nobody said what everyone was thinking. Margaret put the coffee on and looked at the smoke coming off the firebox with the expression of a woman doing a private calculation. She asked Thomas, without looking at him, whether he had checked the rest of the pile. He told her the covered sections were still good. She asked him how long they would last at the current rate. He gave her the number he had been working out in his head since the lantern light. She was quiet for a moment, pouring coffee she did not yet drink. "That's not until March," she said. It was not a question. He told her he knew. Across the valley, the same calculation was running in every household, each family arriving at its own version of the same uncomfortable sum. The Hendersons, up near the confluence, had positioned their pile better than most on a raised platform that kept the bottom courses off the ground, and their losses to the rain had been smaller, but not small enough to be comfortable given the winter they were in. The Caldwell family situation had moved from difficult to genuinely alarming. Old Ren Purcell had ridden to Stevensville a second time and come back with a face that told everyone in the trading post what the trip had cost him. The valley was discovering in the most direct and unsparing way that the preparations it had made in September were not the preparations September had looked like they were. Samuel Webb did not share these problems in the same degree because Samuel Webb was already excavating. He had started the day after his visit to Eleanor's property, working the south-facing slope on the far side of his barn, where the soil composition felt right under the probe he drove into it, where the drainage lines ran away from the intended opening rather than toward it. His sons, the older one 17, the younger one 14, worked alongside him with the focused energy of young men who have been told the reason for a thing and have decided the reason is good. They made faster progress than Eleanor had made alone, and by the end of the first week, they had a chamber that was rough but functional, lined with whatever flat stone they could pry from the creek bank before it locked over entirely. Webb transferred the driest portion of his remaining wood supply underground immediately before the second hard freeze arrived, and he covered the entrance with sod and dead grass and the 3-stone marker that Eleanor had described. And he went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and added up what he had left in the outdoor pile versus what was now sheltered, and the sum was better than it had been a week ago, meaningfully better. And the feeling that came with it was not satisfaction exactly, but the specific relief of a man who has caught a problem before it became a disaster, rather than after. Within 10 days, the difference was detectable in the way his stove ran, the way his chimney drew, the way his family moved through the house in the mornings without the particular hunched deliberateness of people conserving warmth. He burned the compromised outdoor wood first and let the underground chamber do its work on the rest, and the household found a rhythm that the past 3 weeks had not allowed. His wife noticed the change before she commented on it, which was her way, watching until she was certain and then saying one precise thing. She told him on a Sunday morning that they had burned 12% less wood than the previous Sunday, while maintaining the same temperature in the kitchen. She said this in the tone of scientific reporting rather than praise. He drank his coffee and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Thomas Holt heard about the chamber from Webb on a Saturday when both men were at the trading post collecting supplies. Webb described it plainly without embellishment, the way a man described something that worked when he knew the person he was talking to needed something that worked. He described the site selection, the drainage, the ventilation, the temperature he had measured inside on the third morning after completion at a point when the surface temperature was 18 below the differential, had struck him as nearly unbelievable, until he considered the physics of it, the sheer thermal mass of undisturbed Earth, insulating what was within it from what was happening above. Thomas listened with the focused attention of a man revising a previous opinion in real time. He asked where Webb had learned this. Webb told him. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Thomas Holt was not a man who enjoyed being wrong, but he was a man who preferred correct information to comfortable information. And he sat with the revised picture of Eleanor Marsh that Webb's account required for longer than was socially comfortable before he spoke. She tried to tell Margaret, he said finally, in September. Webb did not comment on this. Some conclusions were better reached alone. Thomas went to Eleanor's property that afternoon. She was splitting kindling on the step, and she looked up when he arrived, with the same composed attention she brought to everything, waiting to learn what kind of visit this was going to be. He told her he had heard about the chamber from Webb, and he told her he was going to build one, and he asked if she would be willing to tell him anything he needed to know before he started. She set down the hatchet. She told him what he asked, and she told him what he did not ask but needed to know. And when he left an hour later, he had a design in his head that was close to hers, but already incorporating the refinements that his longer experience with the local soil composition suggested. He built it in 4 days alone because both his sons were away that week. His version was slightly larger than Eleanor's, 4 meters deep rather than 3, with a double-layer stone floor that he packed with sand between the courses to address the capillary moisture she had mentioned coming up through the base of a chamber in its early weeks. He moved his remaining good firewood underground on a Tuesday evening in the fading light, and when he pulled the door closed and walked back to the cabin, the woodpile outside was a fraction of what it had been, and the fraction that remained would have told anyone watching that this family was in trouble. He found this deeply satisfying. What Thomas did not know, and what nobody in the valley except Samuel Webb knew yet, was that Eleanor had not slept properly in 4 days. The night in question had been a Sunday 11 days into December, when the temperature at sunset had been 25 below and still falling. She had heard a sound at 8 in the evening, a low, soft concussion she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears, the kind of sound a structure made when it settled under load. She had been almost certain it came from the direction of the hillside. She had put on every layer she owned and gone out into the dark. The cold at 25 below was not a temperature so much as a condition. It arrived against the skin as something almost solid, something with mass and intention, and it found every gap in clothing with the methodical patience of something that had been doing this for longer than people had been trying to stop it. She had her lantern and her coat and her scarf wrapped twice around her face, and she walked the 9 meters to the hillside with her head down against a wind that had picked up since sunset, steady and purposeful and mean. The stones were buried. She had to feel for them with her boot sweeping back and forth through the top layer of drifted snow until her foot found the first one. The latch was frozen. She worked at it with her gloved fingers and made no progress and switched to her bare hand for 30 seconds, which was approximately how long her bare hand was useful at that temperature, and got the latch mechanism moving, and then got it open and descended the 5 steps and held the lantern up. The chamber was intact. The wall on the left side had shed a small section of facing stone from a joint she had not packed tightly enough, and a fist-sized piece had fallen to the floor. That was the sound she had heard, stone on stone with the particular resonance that traveled through compacted earth. and arrived amplified in a wooden structure, sitting on the same ground. She stood in the steady cool of the chamber, and breathed, and looked at the small pile of fallen rock, and felt the specific unraveling that comes not from danger itself, but from the moment after danger turns out to have been smaller than the fear of it. She replaced the stone. She repacked the joint with clay she scraped from the wall with her knife. She checked the other joints by lantern light, pressing her fingers into each one to test its integrity, finding two more that were softer than she wanted, and packing those as well. She was underground for perhaps 20 minutes, which was 19 minutes longer than her usual retrieval trips. And when she climbed back out and stood upright in the wind at 25 below, she discovered that she had been underground long enough for the cold to have made a decision about how it was going to treat her. Walk back to the cabin. She was 12 steps from the door when she went down. The surface between the chamber entrance and the cabin step had built up a layer of clear ice under the snow from the drainage channel's freeze-thaw cycles, invisible until your boot found the wrong edge of it. And her boot found the wrong edge of it. And she went sideways and down with no warning. The lantern went out when it hit the snow. She lay on her back in the dark and the wind and the cold that was 25 below, and had been waiting for exactly this. The pain in her left hip was sharp and present, and she assessed it immediately with the same clinical attention she would have applied to any structural problem. Checking whether the joint moved the way it should, finding that it did, concluding that she had bruised something significant but broken nothing. She was not injured in any way that would prevent her from getting up. This was the assessment that mattered. She got up. But the seconds she lay in that dark were seconds she did not forget, and the feeling in them was not fear of the cold or fear of the injury, but the particular cold clarity of understanding that she was in this field alone, that no light was burning in any window. She could see that the nearest person who might notice her absence was Thomas Holt across the creek, and Thomas Holt would not notice anything until morning. And that morning was a long way away at 25 below. The thought did not spiral. She had spent 9 months learning the specific discipline of not letting thoughts spiral when she was alone, and there was no one to be panicked at. But the thought lodged itself precisely and permanently in the part of her mind where important information went. She found the cabin step by feel, and went inside and stood near the stove until the shaking stopped, which took longer than she thought it would. When it stopped, she took off her coat and examined her hip in the firelight and confirmed the bruise, and then she sat at the table and thought about what to do with what she had understood lying on the ice. The next morning, she hung a lantern on a hook outside the cabin door. Before she went out, a light in the window. When she was inside, a lantern on the hook. When she was anywhere on the property after dark. It was a signal visible only to the person who understood it, a system of accountability that asked nothing of anyone else and depended on nothing she could not control. It was the most alone thing she had ever done, and she knew it, and she did it anyway, because the alternative was to pretend that the night on the ice had not taught her something she needed to apply. December moved through itself with the slow institutional patience of a month that knew it had the numbers on its side. The cold eased slightly in the third week, temperatures rising to 8 or 10 below during the afternoons. And then it came back harder than before in the final days, announcing January, the way a herald announced a king, loudly with precedent violence. 3 families in the northern part of the valley burned through their outdoor reserves before Christmas sooner than any of them had estimated, and had to make decisions about what they were burning. Next, decisions that took on the sharp quality of genuine emergency when the options were examined too closely. The Caldwell household sent their 2 youngest children to stay with relatives in Stevensville, reducing the warmth requirement of their cabin by a meaningful fraction. The valley understood what the children's absence meant without anyone saying it directly. Daniel Cross rode down from the confluence in the last week of December, 25 kilometers in weather that suggested the journey was not casual. He was a large man on a large horse, and he arrived at Thomas Holt's property with the direct manner of someone who had ridden a significant distance to find out whether something he had heard was true. Holt took him around back and showed him the chamber, and watched Cross examine it with the methodical thoroughness of a man assessing a piece of equipment, checking the ventilation, checking the floor, picking up a piece of the stored wood, and testing its dryness with his bare palm against the cut face of the timber. Cross was quiet for a long time after coming back up the steps. How long to build it? His breath made clouds in the cold air above the open door. Holt told him 4 days working alone and his estimate for a man with 2 hands assisting. Cross nodded and rode back north the same afternoon, already planning the location in his mind, already thinking about which of his men he would pull off other work to start the excavation before the ground froze beyond the point of practical work. Word was moving through the valley by then. The way word always moved in places where people's distances from each other were measured in riding time, slowly, carefully, with the accretion of detail that came from being told and retold by people who each added what they had personally observed. Webb had told Holt. Holt had told his wife. Margaret Holt had spoken to 2 women at the trading post, with the particular precision of someone who has worked out exactly how much to say and how to say it, so that the idea arrived as information rather than instruction, because people resisted instruction in ways they did not resist information. The 2 women had spoken to their husbands, and one of the husbands had started digging before the week was out. 3 days before Christmas, Eleanor answered a knock at her door to find Margaret Holt standing on her step, with a covered plate and an expression that had put in considerable work before arriving at its current arrangement. The plate held 2 pieces of dried apple pie, the kind of gift that required no reciprocity and made no demands, and was designed as an opening rather than an exchange. Eleanor stepped back from the door without speaking, and Margaret came in and they sat at the table and ate the pie with coffee and talked for 2 hours about things that were not the chamber. Mostly, though, the chamber was present in the conversation, the way an important thing was present when nobody was addressing it directly yet, because they had not found the right way in. At the end of the 2 hours, Margaret said what she had come to say. "I told Thomas in September that you had mentioned underground storage. I told him it sounded like something worth thinking about." She looked at her coffee cup. "He said we had been doing fine with what we had always done." A pause. "I should have pressed harder." Eleanor looked at her across the table and thought about the 9 months of solitary winter that had preceded this conversation. And she said the thing that had been true from the beginning and would stay true after everything else had changed. "You are pressing now." Margaret looked up. The expression on her face had stopped working so hard and arrived somewhere that was simply tired and sincere. "We all are," she said, slowly. January arrived the way the worst things arrived. Not suddenly, but with a slow accumulation of evidence that made the moment of full arrival feel both inevitable and somehow still surprising. The temperature on the second day of the new year dropped to 31 below at night, and the valley woke into a silence so complete that it registered as a kind of pressure. The silence of a landscape that had stopped moving entirely, every creek and branch and blade of frozen grass locked into absolute stillness by cold, that had moved past weather into something closer to geology. Smoke from the homestead chimneys rose perfectly vertical in the windless air, each column a precise record of what was burning inside. And the records were not encouraging. The dark, heavy columns that had characterized December had thickened further, which meant families were burning more and getting less, which meant the reserves were drawing down faster than any autumn calculation had prepared them for. Thomas Holt walked his fence line on the 3rd morning of January and counted what he had left in the outdoor pile and what he had underground and ran the numbers against what remained of the winter, and arrived at a conclusion that would have been alarming 2 months ago and was now merely sobering, which itself represented a significant improvement in his situation. He had enough, not comfortably enough, not with the margin he preferred, but enough if he continued managing consumption with the precision Margaret had been applying since December. The system required attention, but it worked, and the difference between a system that required attention and a crisis that required luck was a difference he had come to appreciate with considerable specificity. Samuel Webb's household was in better shape than Holt's, partly because he had started earlier and partly because his chamber was better drained. In the third week of January, he opened the door and descended with a lantern and ran his palm along a row of stored timber, the way he had done 6 times since December, checking for any change in surface condition. The wood was unchanged. If anything, it was drier than it had been in October, still releasing the last of its summer moisture through the ventilation channels into the cold air above. He stood in the chamber for a moment longer than the task required, just standing in the stillness of it, in the temperature that did not change, and he thought about all the winters he had spent fighting his fuel supply, and understood that he had been fighting a problem that had a solution, and the solution had been available the whole time, waiting for someone to need it badly enough to find it. He closed the door and went back to the cabin and sat at his kitchen table and wrote a letter to his brother in Oregon, describing the chamber in detail, the dimensions, the soil selection, the ventilation angle, the floor construction. He sent it with the next rider heading west, not knowing whether his brother would act on it or lose it, but having sent it, which was the part he could control. Daniel Cross finished his chamber in the first week of January, working his 2 hired men through the short daylight hours with the focused urgency of a man racing the ground freeze rather than the calendar. His version was the largest yet, nearly 5 meters deep, wide enough for 2 men to pass each other inside with a second ventilation channel that Webb had suggested. He had less cured wood than he needed for the full winter because he had started late, but what he had underground was performing exactly as described, and the portion not yet in the chamber he managed with the new discipline of someone who understood the value of what he had. The climax of the winter came in the first week of February, when a storm front moved in from the northwest and sat over the valley for 4 days with temperatures that dropped to 36 below on the second night. The wind was the worst of it, not strong enough to be dramatic, but persistent enough to be punishing, finding every gap in every structure with a cold that had weight to it. Physical weight, the kind that pressed on the chest and slowed the thinking. The Henderson family lost a section of their roof on the 3rd day, a 10-foot span of shingles stripped clean by a gust that arrived without warning. They addressed it partially and managed the cold coming through the gap with additional fuel and additional bodies. Everyone sleeping in the kitchen for 2 nights using each other's warmth, the way people did before they had the option of better solutions. Eleanor spent those 4 days in the cabin with the particular focused stillness of someone who has made all their preparations and has nothing left to do but let the preparations work. She had enough wood, she had enough food, she had the work she always had, the mending. The small repairs the planning conducted at the kitchen table with paper and pencil. On the second night, she woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of wind pressing against the north wall with a force she had not heard before in this building, and she lay in the dark listening to the cabin's response, the small creaks and adjustments of a wooden structure, doing what wooden structures did under load flexing rather than breaking, settling into the pressure rather than fighting it. James had built it right. She had known that in ordinary times, but she knew it differently in moments like this one, in the particular intimacy of being the only person inside something that was being tested. She did not go to the chamber during the storm. She had calculated before it arrived that she had enough wood inside the cabin for 4 days without a resupply, and she had made that calculation specifically so she would not have to navigate the ground between the cabin and the hillside in conditions that had put her on the ice once already. The discipline of that decision cost her something. She wanted to check the chamber, wanted the confirmation of her own eyes. But she understood that what she wanted and what was sensible were not the same thing. And she had long since learned to defer to the second category. On the 5th morning, the storm broke and she went out into a world that had been redistributed. The snow was 4 feet deep in the open meadow and absent in long wind-scraped patches along the fence lines. She found the chamber door under 2.5 feet of packed snow that took 15 minutes to clear, and when she opened it, The air that came up was exactly what it always was, cool and dry and carrying the quiet smell of well-kept wood. And she descended the 5 steps and stood in the steady underground temperature and felt something release in her chest that she had not fully known she was holding. The facing stone she had repaired in December was holding. The ventilation channels were clear. Everything was as she had left it. She loaded the canvas sling and climbed back out into the bright post-storm light, and the valley spread out below her in the way it always spread out after a major storm, pristine and entirely indifferent to what it had just done. Samuel Webb rode over that afternoon to check on her arriving with the manner of a man doing something he had decided was simply what neighbors did. She was splitting kindling on the step when he arrived, the hip that had bruised in December, still registering a faint protest on the coldest mornings, but no longer limiting her in any way that mattered. He asked how she had come through the storm. She told him the cabin was fine, the chamber was fine, she was fine. He looked at her with the assessment of a man who had learned not to take that answer entirely at face value, but had also learned that pressing further would be declined. He told her several families in the Northern Valley had burned through their visible reserves and were now making decisions that families should not have to make in the back half of winter. Next year will be different, Eleanor said. Not a prediction exactly, a statement of what was already in motion. Webb considered this. He had 3 conversations scheduled in the following week with men who wanted to build chambers before spring gave way to summer, men who wanted to get the design right and get the wood in the ground before the next October arrived with its own version of rain and cold. It already is different, he said. 11 chambers in the valley as of last week, more starting in spring. She looked out at the post-storm landscape, at the white expanse of the meadow and the dark line of the frozen creek, and the shapes of the other homesteads at their various distances, each one a question about how well its family had come through the last 4 days. "Tell me about the Henderson roof," she said. "What do they need?" This was how she was, and Webb had come to understand it as characteristic, rather than deflecting the pivot from the subject of her own accomplishment to the practical question of what still needed doing. She did not perform modesty, she simply moved toward the next problem. The way water moved past a stone in a creek. Not because she did not register the stone, but because standing still was not what water did. He told her about the roof. She told him she had timber that could be cut to the right dimensions. He said he could bring his son over on Saturday to help with the cutting and hauling, and she said that would be fine, and they discussed the Henderson repair with the focused specificity of 2 people who knew how to talk about work. And then he rode back to his own property, and she went inside and added the Saturday repair to the list she kept in the back of her household ledger. February moved toward March, with the grudging incremental progress of a winter that was not yet finished, but had accepted that it was losing. The temperatures rose slightly in the second week, enough to soften the snow surface during the afternoons before the nights hardened it again, a cycle that was the specific signature of a season turning rather than broken. Eleanor noted it with the attention she brought to everything the climate communicated, measuring not just the current conditions, but the trajectory, the rate at which the balance was shifting toward the warmth that was still weeks away, but was no longer entirely theoretical. She went to the chamber on the 1st of March and took stock. She had more wood remaining than she had expected, a full third of what she had started with in October, because the winter had not been longer than the previous ones, despite its greater intensity, and because her consumption management had been more precise than her initial calculations had required. She sat on the steps inside the chamber with the lantern and looked at the remaining stacks and understood that she had solved the problem she had set out to solve completely without assistance, and that the solution had worked not just for her, but for 11 other families and counting, and that it would work for more the following winter, because the idea was out now and moving under its own power. She thought about James. She thought about what he would have said standing in this chamber he had not known would exist when he filed on this land. He had been a practical man who valued practical results. And the practical result here was a third of a cord of dry timber on the 1st of March in a valley that had eaten its reserves alive. He would have approved. He would have also. She thought immediately begun planning what he would do differently the second time, because that was who he had been, someone who improved things, who could not look at a working system without wondering how to make it work better. She had been trying to do that herself. In the months since the previous February, in the way she lived in this land, he had chosen for both of them. People still came through March and into April, asking questions that had become more specific as the winter's lessons were absorbed and the planning for next winter began. A woman named Ruth Calder from the north end of the valley came alone one Saturday morning, having ridden an hour to get there, and sat at Eleanor's kitchen table with a hand-drawn map of her own property and asked about site selection with the focused preparation of someone who had been studying the question and had narrowed it to 2 possible locations. Eleanor looked at the map and asked about the soil composition at each site, and asked which direction the natural drainage ran, and told her which location was better and why. And Ruth Calder listened and asked 3 follow-up questions, and rode home with what she needed. She said thank you in the way you thanked someone who had given you information you were going to use, which was the kind of gratitude that Eleanor found she could accept without difficulty. The Henderson roof was repaired on the 2nd Saturday of March, the day dry and cold and clear. 4 people working together, including Eleanor, whose hip had healed completely. She worked alongside Webb's older son and Margaret Holt, who had come because she knew how to hold a timber straight, and they finished by mid-afternoon and stood in the yard looking at the repaired section with the shared satisfaction of people who have done a concrete thing well. Margaret handed around a flask of coffee from a tin she had packed, and they drank it standing in the cold, and nobody said much because what had just happened did not need language to be understood by the people who had done it. A surveyor came through the valley in April, a man from Missoula working a land use assessment for the territorial office, and he stopped at several properties and recorded what he observed with professional notation. He noted the chambers at Webb's property and at Holt's, and at 2 others he visited, and wrote that the practice of underground fuel storage appeared to be producing measurable improvements in winter heating efficiency in this part of the Bitterroot Valley. He used careful, qualified language because he was producing an official document, and he attributed the practice to the valley generally rather than to any specific origin, because he did not know the origin and did not ask. Eleanor did not know about the surveyor's report and would not have cared particularly if she had. She was preparing the south field for planting, working the soil with the iron-tined fork that James had bought in Stevensville the spring before he died, turning the earth that had spent the winter frozen into something that was ready to receive seeds and produce from them. Thomas Holt appeared at the edge of her field in late afternoon, riding slowly along the fence line, with no particular hurry, the way a man appeared when he had not made a specific plan to appear, but had ended up heading in a direction anyway. He pulled up at the gate and looked at the work she had done and did not offer to help, because the field was already 2/3 turned, and the help would be more social than practical, and they both understood that. He sat his horse for a moment looking at the turned earth and at the hillside beyond the cabin, where the chamber entrance remained invisible from this distance as it had been designed to be. 11 chambers before winter ended, he said. Counting what Cross built up north, maybe 14 in the wider region, more starting this summer. He paused. Margaret heard from a woman in the Flathead Valley who had heard about it from a rider. Said they are thinking about it up there too. Eleanor pushed the fork into the earth and leaned on it. The afternoon light was lengthening in the way of early spring, the day reluctant to end the sky above the western peaks, still holding color at an hour when January would have been fully dark. She looked at Holt sitting on his horse at the gate and thought about the winter just past the 14 families and the knowledge moving through them. And she said the thing that had been true from the beginning and would stay true after everything else had changed. The ones who tried it will do it again. The ones who watch them will do it next year. The ones who hear about it second-hand will do it the year after that. That is how things that work spread. She pulled the fork free and moved to the next row. I did not invent it. I just needed it badly enough to remember it. Holt sat with that for a moment. He adjusted his hat against the evening light. He asked in the straightforward way he had finally learned to ask her things, whether she needed anything before spring got fully underway. She told him she needed seed corn if he had extra, and that the gate hinge on the south fence had been giving trouble since the thaw. He said he had seed corn and could look at the hinge on Saturday. She said that would do. He rode back toward his own property in the long spring light, and she returned to the field, and the work continued until the light failed. She stayed in the Bitterroot Valley through several more winters after that one, and each winter was easier than the previous in the specific practical sense that the valley had learned something and retained it and built on it the cumulative advantage of knowledge that compounded rather than merely persisting. The chamber she had built in the autumn of 1878 continued to perform at the same specification from the beginning. Steady underground temperature, dry air, the quiet provision of what had been asked of it. She repaired the door twice. She improved the ventilation cap design in the second year, based on what she had observed about snow behavior at the opening. She repacked 2 sections of wall stone in the third year. When she found a seep she had not anticipated, sourcing the water to a subsurface vein and correcting it with a redirected drainage trench that solved the problem completely. When she finally left, she walked through the chamber one final time on the morning the buyers arrived to take possession of the property. The new owners, a young couple from Wisconsin, who had come west with more optimism than experience, but enough fundamental competence to learn from what they found, stood at the top of the steps while she descended and held her lantern up one last time. The wood she had left for them was stacked along the back wall. The temperature was what it always was. The air was dry. The facing stones were solid. Everything was as it should be. She told the couple what they needed to know, in the same way she had always told people what they needed to know, clearly, specifically, without ceremony. She told them the drainage behavior in spring thaw, the ventilation adjustment for summer, the markers for finding the door under deep snow. She told them how long to let new wood sit before moving it underground, and at what point in autumn to close the secondary ventilation channel. She told them where the seep had been and what she had done to redirect it. The woman wrote it down in a small notebook with careful handwriting. The man listened and nodded and asked 2 good questions. Eleanor answered them and climbed back up into the April light and closed the door. Thomas Holt was waiting at the road. He had come to see her off without, she suspected, fully intending to arrive at that decision the same way he had arrived at the fence that April evening years ago, not by plan but by the direction his horse kept going. He was older than he had been in that November of 1878, which was obvious and not worth noting. But he wore the additional years differently than most men did, more settled in himself, less given to the defensive certainty that had characterized the man who had left a load of pine she had not asked for, and ridden home feeling righteous. He sat his horse and looked at the valley going green in the early April way, the particular tentative green of a landscape that had survived another winter and was not yet sure of the spring. She pulled up beside him, and they looked at the valley together for a moment without speaking. And in that moment, the winter of 1878 was present between them. The way important shared experiences became present, when the people who had shared them stood close enough to each other, not spoken, not displayed, just there with the weight that things had when they had been real and were now also history. The ones coming after us will think it has always been this way, Holt said. They will not know there was a winter when people were burning wet wood and struggling, and one household in this valley was not. Eleanor looked at the hillside behind her cabin, where the door in the earth waited for the new owners to find it and use it, and eventually take it entirely for granted. That is how it is supposed to work, she said. If they have to know where it started, it has not spread far enough. Sate Santom She rode toward Missoula in the morning light with what she had, which was less than some people started with, and more than most people finished with. And the valley settled into its spring routines behind her, with the unhurried permanence of a place that has stored what it needed and is ready for what comes next. The earth held its temperature in the chamber below the hillside. It would hold the same temperature tomorrow and the winter after that, patient and constant offering. What it had always offered to anyone willing to put the right question to it and do the work the answer required.